Thank you, Dr. T, for that wonderful presentation. We will now look through some questions. Is that right, Dr. T?
Yes, I'd love to hear folks' questions. And then after taking some questions, I have a bunch more slides that talk about some very specific techniques that are associated with each of those tasks that I just discussed. But love to hear specific questions or comments about anything that I talked about in that earlier presentation.
Great. Right now, I think we have one question so far. It's about applying this the integrative harm reduction therapy in on the ground. How do we get it there? Like maybe here in the Philippines, how can we get IHRP to be integrated into ground services? Maybe in our frontliners for local government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, one comment about that to consider is that what I've attempted to do by mapping out these 7 tasks is really kind of create a roadmap, right? To sort of organize what we're doing, what are the different tasks, the different major things we want to do when we're trying to be helpful to folks. And in each of those tasks, as you'll see a little bit in the second part of my presentation, I've tried to really operationalize the tasks in very plain, simple language so that that all sorts of folks with different levels of training can learn those tasks both for themselves and can teach them to others. So I think that while we call this integrative harm reduction psychotherapy, I think of therapy in the broadest sense, that is any helping relationship or any helping contact that we may have. So I hope and think that this model can be adapted to people who are working with folks in many different contexts. Now, how can we get it there? Well, I think it's through talks like this. If you go to my booth here at the conference, we've put a number of papers there that you can access for free. The first chapter of my book is available for free. There are some other videos up there. So I think there are a lot of resources that can at least help people begin to get going in learning this. And as I think Rod said before, I've been to the Philippines twice. We've done some trainings before. We had some really wonderful experiences. And I think hopefully before too long, when we get back, we can get back in the room with each other. I will be coming back to do another training in person. But actually, we've also been doing trainings during the pandemic online. So it's possible that we could work with NoBox to get a online training available to anyone who wants to take the entire intensive training.
Great. Thank you, Dr. T. So we have some resources in Dr. Tatarsky's booth. And then we also have coming up a training, hopefully someday here in the Philippines with Dr. Tatarsky again. So when things get better, fingers crossed, we can do that. We have another question here. Thank you very much, Dr. Tatarsky. Such an insightful presentation. In your work for people with problematic use, how much of childhood trauma do you see as a contributing factor?
I think that childhood trauma is very, very frequently a contributing factor. But I'm reluctant to say that what we call addiction, and I put addiction in quotes because I think addiction is a problematic concept because it's so associated with disease. I think that what we call addiction is not always related to problematic or early childhood trauma. Like there are some wonderful people who believe that to be the case. But I think that current social circumstances and life circumstances can overwhelm any of our capacity to cope and manage, and can render us really vulnerable to turning to substances. So all people that have experienced childhood trauma don't develop addictive behaviors, and I think all people that engage in addictive behaviors don't have early childhood trauma. And we don't need to sort of boil it, sort of pin it on childhood trauma in order to help people work with these issues. One other thought that I have, which is maybe even a bit more radical, is if we think about the qualities that we typically use to define addiction: craving, compulsion, loss of control, continued use despite negative consequences, I think that that experience is an experience that's universal. Every human on the planet has experienced at some point that experience of feeling compelled, out of control, and continuing to do something in spite of negative consequences. So I actually think that what we call addiction is really related to universal human experience. Now, we may all have experienced trauma at some point that contributes to that. But I think it's really troubling to sort of point to the folks that have really out of control substance use and say they are different from the rest of us humans. But I find it more useful to think about there being a continuum of human experience, and we can all be vulnerable to moving into those addictive behaviors given certain challenging circumstances.
Thank you, Dr. D. I really love how you framed it as a universal human experience, and really seeing the context, which I think we also discussed yesterday with like the drug set setting framework and everything. So that really ties it up. We have another question here from Matt Southwell. How can practitioners learn to manage their patients and congruence and meet the client where they are? What happens when practitioners can rush ahead of the client and push for goals that are not owned? I think it's a perfect question. We have a lot of practitioners who are present right now. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. T.
Well, this is why I said I think that the core principle of a harm reduction framework is that we support positive change as the individual defines it, and that we are radically committed to keeping our own agendas, our own values, to the side, so that we don't impose them. Because I think the imposition of our values and our agendas derails the therapeutic alliance. It can be traumatizing. That is really imposing, even in the guise of helping. Our wish to help can push ahead of where the client is, and the client can experience that as an impingement, as a violation, as a trauma. And so I think that the radical harm reduction commitment kind of gives us a frame for that. And we might think of what you're talking about as a countertransference error. That is, the therapeutic language about having a feeling in relation to the person we're trying to be helpful to and acting it out on the person is a kind of countertransference violation or a lapse. So that our job as helpers is to try to stay on top of our feelings, our agendas as much as possible, and really take our lead from the patient or from the therapeutic dialogue. So that's a partial answer to that question.
There's one more question here, maybe before we move on to the second part of your session, Dr. T. Hi, Dr. Tatarsky, could you talk a little bit about your work on chemsex and whether you tailor your approach based on specific population groups, for example, gay and bi men, transgender people, sex workers, etc.?
Well, I think certainly, each of these groups of people that you mentioned has their own unique culture, set of challenges, social challenges, personal challenges, and so on. But I don't discriminate. I mean, I think that our harm reduction therapy, which is a therapy that actually is adapted to each individual, when we talk about working collaboratively, starting from where the person is, it's really that we take our lead from the person that we're trying to be helpful to. And we have to be committed to managing our own feelings and values and so on. So that the therapy that evolves out of that collaborative work really is a therapy that's uniquely tailored to each individual. So I see this work as providing a model, a kind of an overall model or a framework for doing that But what we're trying to do is to work collaboratively to create a therapy that will support each individual to clarify what's true for them, what goals and approach to positive change is going to best suit them, rather than imposing that on folks. Oh, and chemsex you mentioned. I think, of course, very often drugs and sex are intimately intertwined. People may use drugs in order to enhance sex. People may find that drugs actually help them access their sexuality. So I think that drug-sex link is really important to know about, and to actually address both parts of it, because as I said in my earlier presentation, our relationships to substances are multiply meaningful, as are our relationships to our sexuality. And so that's a really important and complicated relationship between drugs and sex. Each part of that needs to be honored, respected, and needs curiosity, to support people in their own personal exploration of what that means to them in their lives.
Thank you, Dr. T. We can now proceed. I'll reserve some of the questions later on after your presentation. So
okay, and since we're somewhat tight on time, I'm probably going to go through these slides relatively quickly, just sort of naming some techniques that might be useful, and try to leave about 10 minutes on the end to come back for Q&A and discussion. So I talked about the first foundational therapeutic task is managing the therapeutic alliance, and it's really something that we need to do throughout the treatment. People come, particularly, people who are problematic drug users have had not just the possibility of early trauma, but have had multiple traumas being people who use drugs. At the hands of the police, at the hands of prior treatment providers, at the hands of their families, because we live in a criminalizing and stigmatizing and otherizing culture. So it makes sense that people will be entering any helping relationship who have experienced that with a lot of mistrust, a lot understandable mistrust. And so often the work on establishing an alliance takes time. I think that helping professionals need to take responsibility for proving their trustworthiness. So it's really on the helpers to prove that we should be trusted. Now, and that's a process that may go on over many months or maybe even many years. But these are some basic engagement skills that I think, for me, are like the translation of those harm reduction principles into a therapeutic stance, a helping stance. Start where the person is. How do we do that? Well, the first thing that we can do is we can listen empathically. That is, be committed to listening to people to try to really get their experience. So it's really an activity that happens within us. How are they feeling? How are they doing? What's the content? And when we are not clear about things, then the second skill is what I call collaborative inquiry. Can we invite the person to be curious with us together in a collaborative exploration, a deepening exploration of what they're bringing? Then once we have a sense that we really get that person's experience, we can reflect empathically. Empathic reflection reflects back. This is what I think I'm hearing you say. This is what I think I'm hearing you feeling. And then the checking in is so important. Am I getting it right? Am I on target? Because it's possible that we could be distorting, we could be projecting our own experience onto the person. So when we can check in and say, this is what I've heard, am I getting it right? And the client, the participant, says, yes, I feel understood. I feel like you're getting my experience. Now we're in alliance. And that is a process that I think can help establish an initial alliance and also keep us in alliance throughout the course of the therapy. It kind of helps us stay in alliance. When we're not getting the client, we may have what we call a rupture, and the client begins to feel withdrawn, seems to shut down. Then we've probably missed something, and we need to check in. I guess I hadn't heard you. Can we? We have to own that the rupture as likely a mistake that we made, and kind of invite the client to tell us. I talked about countertransference. Of course, we may have all sorts of feelings and reactions and fantasies and thoughts that we need to be able to contain and manage so that they don't contaminate and we don't project them onto the client. And as we're listening, we also want to listen for a kind of psychobiosocial multiple meanings formulation. This is how I'm understanding, the struggles that you have, your relationship with substances. Am I getting it right? And together, as we come up with a formulation that is a theory of people's struggles, and people kind of really feel that the formulation fits their experience, that then can help kind of map, the things that we'll be working on together in the therapy. So the therapeutic relationship heals is the second task. And I think as I said before, when we've got a good therapeutic relationship, it creates a kind of a safety that is conducive to people feeling open to looking at themselves, to reflecting, to being curious about their experience. And this can really support people in finding lost parts of themselves that were disconnected. Now, there's a really hugely important idea, which is what some people call the corrective emotional experience or the corrective relational experience. If people bring conflicts that they have that may actually get played out around their substance use from childhood, that is, when I feel angry, I turn to a substance rather than being able to share it with a person. And also, I've been shamed and blamed and criticized and punished for my substance use. And when people come into the therapeutic relationship, they come in both with those negative expectations about their being met in that negative way around their substance use, and also around the issues that are embedded in or getting expressed through the substance. So our harm reduction stance, which is one of acceptance, of respect, of curiosity, actually creates a possible new experience of being met in a new, more positive, respectful way, which can begin to heal some of the trauma that people have experienced around their drug use and around the issues that are embedded in the drug use. So when we say, I wonder why you were using in that way, and people can begin to connect with the feelings and put them into words, they now have a new relational experience, which is really safe to be more fully present with themselves in relation to us. And resolving those conflicts could be really one of the keys to helping people resolve their problematic relationship to substances. Now, this is so important. I mentioned enhancing self-management. This could, one of the hallmark symptoms of trauma is difficulties managing intense feeling states. And if people feel overwhelmed with negative feelings, they may move impulsively into action to take something or do something to try to calm it down, to settle down the intensity so that they don't, feel like they're going crazy. And to ask people to give up the substance or that activity before they've developed the ability to sit still and self-soothe is really a setup for failure. So we invite people to come into treatment with their substance use, with their addictive behaviors. And we can both, in the therapeutic, empathic therapeutic relationship, support people in developing the capacity to comfort themselves. That's an implicit process. But we can also teach, active skills for self-managing intense feelings. Our curiosity invites people to be curious about themselves. And that curiosity then supports a kind of self-reflectiveness. Our empathic attunement supports people in developing empathy for themselves. And then mindfulness skills, that is, clearing away shame and guilt and being able to bring a kind of curious, accepting awareness to the feeling that one has actually enhances the capacity to tolerate that feeling. Mindfulness research has really shown a very strong connection to enhancing self-regulation and affect regulation. Now, this is one of my favorite techniques. I talked in the earlier recorded piece about how the urge is the axis for change. Imagine that, or consider that any verbal or physical action, behavior, begins with an urge. And if we can help people identify the urge before they move into action, that is that really strong urge at a feeling level, at a felt level, in terms of thoughts and feelings, and cultivate the capacity to sit still with the urge through mindfulness techniques, bringing curious, accepting awareness to the urge, and breathing slowly and deeply with the urge. Now we can consider that people are surfing over the surface of that urge, right? This is Alan Marlat's idea. And if we can surf that urge, it strengthens our capacity to sit still with it. Even if we're not ready or clear about a change that we want to make in the ultimate behavior. But urge surfing enables us then to become curious about what is driving this urge? Why do I want to engage in this behavior? Is this choice the healthiest choice for me? Or might I think about another alternative response that would be more in line with my values, more self-affirming and healthier? So urge surfing enables us to do all sorts of things that can promote positive behavior change. See, one of the things that we can now do is what we call assessment as treatment. If I can sit still with my urge and tolerate the distress of sitting with the urge and not acting on it, now I can begin to become curious about the urge and engage in what I call unwrapping the urge. Becoming curious and dialoguing and exploring into the urge. What does this urge want? Or what does this urge want to get away from? Or is there a part of me that lives in this urge? The angry part, the scared part, the sexual part, that has been able to find expression in this behavior. And if I can discover and uncover and put words to all of these different parts of me that have been living in the urge, it becomes possible now to think about whether this is the substance is the best way to respond or express this, or whether there may be alternative ways. Mindfulness also enables what we call a microanalysis, that is, to begin looking in a very nuanced way about the sequences of events that lead up to a choice to engage in a substance in a problematic way. What was the context? What was I feeling? What was I thinking? What led to that decision to engage in that? And as we can sort of elongate that sequence, it becomes possible to think about intervening at each one of those points in the sequence. So now we're into the fifth task, which is embracing ambivalence. Traditionally, in abstinence-based treatment, we're allowed to talk about the part that wants to stop. We were not allowed to talk about the part that wants to keep using, the part that loves using. And if we don't invite the part that loves getting high into the room, that part gets neglected. And that part is going to subvert whatever plans we make with the part that wants to change or wants to stop. So I think we need to really invite both sides of the ambivalence into the room, respect both the part that wants to change, but also the part that is in love with getting high or finds it life-saving, vital, an important part of one's life, so that we can get a constructive dialogue rather than the battle that many people experience. We can talk to both sides, help folks kind of talk to both sides of their ambivalence, and then think about whether there's a new way of resolving that ambivalence, a a way of addressing the parts that are invested in using in problematic ways in a way that will then take some of the intensity out of their desire to use, that will support positive change around the substance use. And now we can start talking about goals. What does the part that wants to use, what is the goal of that part? To feel relaxed, to feel more connected, to feel part of a community. Well, might there be other ways that we could meet those needs? Those would be some harm reduction goals. And in what ways is the substance use problematic? And could we make some little, without necessarily committing to stop, some positive changes in the pattern of use that would reduce some of the harm associated with that problematic use? And the final slide then gets at, once we got some good goals, now we want to help people put together comprehensive positive change plans. And one of the techniques that we use to strategize for positive change is what we call the ideal use plan. How would you ideally want substances in your life? What would the pattern of use be that would maximize the benefit and minimize the risks, or minimize the cost, minimize the harm, as you determine that? So this is all about supporting the individuals in clarifying what their ideal relationship to substance is as they define it. How much, how often, under what circumstances, what other issues would need to be addressed in order to successfully implement that plan. For some people, that will be an abstinence goal. For some people, that will be moderation, or it'll be some of substances in these circumstances and others in those. But I think the critical part of all of this is that harm reduction frame, the stance, the radical accepting stance, creates a space to support people in discovering all of what's true for them. Whereas I think any therapeutic approach that comes in with a priori assumptions about what's right for somebody derails the whole process. And this is why I've really come to believe that the harm reduction frame is essential to effective help across that entire spectrum. So we have a little time left for some Q&A or some comments. So thank you so much for being part of this talk. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions.
Thank you, Dr. Tatarsky. That was amazing, and thank you for all the concrete actions that people can do. A lot of people in the chat are really appreciative of all that you shared through the 7 therapeutic tasks. Let's go to the questions. We have one here about Tetay Mendoza is asking. So thank you for connecting principles of IHRP to us working in the community setting. My question is specific to ATS, or amphetamine-type stimulants. What works for people who use amphetamine-type stimulants?
One of the things that I have actually been concerned about is that in the harm reduction community, there's a lot of emphasis on equipment, safer using practices. What's, we might call substance use management, but, having not sharing equipment is certainly, but the work that I'm presenting is really about arming people and supporting people in developing the capacities to make their own healthy choices about the use of that equipment. So I think that all of what I've been talking about is applicable to anyone who's struggling with a problematic relationship to a substance, including, and I think that since we have, there is some experimentation using prescribed amphetamines for people that are using shabu in problematic ways, or crystal meth in the United States. But I think that what is more of my focus is that there are complex emotional and psychological and relational contextual factors that contribute to why people may be making unhealthy or problematic choices around their substance use, or might actually arm them and support them in making healthier choices. And I think that applies to amphetamine users as well as every other substance user.
Thank you, Dr. T. What I really got out of that is building a relationship first, getting to know how the relationship with drugs are, for example, and taking it from there. We have one question from Dr. Clara. Dr. Clara, would you be open to coming on stage with us to join us for your question? Maybe you can ask Dr. Tatarsky here on stage. Let me try to invite her. Hello, Dr. Clara. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dr.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Tatarsky, and I hope I will have the privilege to be able to attend and become one of your trainees for integrative harm reduction. Actually, you already answered my question, which I posted before you have given your additional 7-point slide. Thank you so much, and I hope I'll be able to attend one of your trainings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Clara.
Thank you.
We have one question here, Dr. Tatarsky, about from Dr. Elena Samonte Hinkley. She's asking about how the steps you outlined are reminiscent of Gestalt therapy in psychology. How similar or different is harm reduction therapy from Gestalt?
Well, I'm not Gestalt trained, so I'm not an expert in Gestalt, but I do think that, you know, Gestalt is really interested in phenomenological experience, and I think harm reduction psychotherapy is also very much interested in people's experience rather than and supporting people and becoming more fully present with themselves. So I think that there's a lot of overlap and consistency between the two approaches.
There's one here from Jaira. Do you think that biological factors also has an effect on substance use or abuse?
You know, absolutely. I think that what is key is that there do seem to be vulnerabilities, biological vulnerabilities. You know, there's the research on genetic contribution to, quote, addiction. And some people suggest that it might be as much as 60%. But I think that that very often people mistake that research to suggest that genetics cause addiction. I think those vulnerabilities may be around things such as a proneness to anxiety, a hypersensitivity, which substance may render somebody more vulnerable to turning down the intensity of those feelings with a substance. I think that's one of the things that happens with trauma. One of the consequences of trauma, as I said, is that there are certain brain changes that can render people more vulnerable to feeling flooded, by feelings, which then can render people vulnerable to turning to substances. But I think we always need to be looking at how those biological factors interact with family, with culture, with social context, with the political, the broader political context, and that all of these other factors can support people in addressing those vulnerabilities to reduce the vulnerability to problematic substance use, or actually increase the vulnerability. And on the other hand, there are certainly biological changes that happen with chronic substance use in terms of brain chemistry and neuron sensitivity, receptor sensitivity. The thing is that all of those changes can remit or sort of normalize over a period of time, which is an argument against the disease theory. But another idea that I have about that is that whatever those biological factors are, meaning gets wrapped around those factors. So the biology of a drug is pleasurable, is reinforcing in relation to not just the biological impact, but the meaning that it has to people. And so we've got to always look at how biology and psychology and social context interact in ways that are unique for each person. And so the psychobiosocial framework says we need to be thinking about all of those factors as they, reflect a unique person in their unique social context.
Great. Thank you, Dr. T. That was nice. The biology wrapped in meaning, seeing it interact with all the other factors. It's a really great way to see it. We have a question here in context of tobacco control. Some Philippine health advocates are concerned that the vaping industry is hijacking the term harm reduction to push for the interests of their industry. Do you have any thoughts on this matter?
I can't really speak to how the industry is hijacking the term. I do think that my sense is that vaping can be a harm reduction strategy because vaping tobacco or nicotine is less harmful than smoking tobacco, and significantly so. However, vaping may have its own negative consequences that we've only just begun to learn something about. So again, I think, and actually the opening speaker, Dr. Carl Hart, really spoke to this. The harm is not in the substance. The harm is in the way that people may use a substance, or the harm may be in the way the society responds to the person who's using the substance. So I think we have to be really careful about calling a particular substance a harm-reducing or harmful agent. It's really about the relationship to the substance, the way one uses it, that makes all the difference.
Thank you. I think we have room for one more question, Dr. T, before we close. So this comes from Jonas. Harm reduction's foot in the door into mainstream treatment program is via disease prevention, which comes with preset goals and is very limiting. How would you resolve the tension this creates?
I don't know. Maybe Jonas has the answer to that. That's a huge, complicated can of worms that I'm probably not an expert in enough to respond to. I'm sorry. Is there one more that I might be able to respond to in a meaningful way?
I think we are good with the questions so far, Dr. Tatarsky. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Do you have any last words before we close?
Yeah, just that, I'm so glad to have the opportunity to participate in this summit and to make contact with this wonderful international group of colleagues and friends. And I'm really always happy to stay in touch with people, hear from people. If you visit our website, centerforoptimalliving.com, there's a comment section. You can send me an email. There's a lot of resources there. And love to strengthen my relationships with the global harm reduction community. So thank you all very much for joining us.